Okay guys, so today's video is about whitewoods, or rather it's a case study on whitewoods, but the topic of the video is deck building and ratios. The reason that math is important for building your deck, what makes a deck good, how much of that is inherent to the deck itself, and how much space do you have to modify how good your deck is. And I want to start by going over the current pre-info format Snake Eyes first to give you a little bit of context. Because every time you build a deck, you're not building in a vacuum. Even if you're going to a large event and you don't know what you're going to be fighting against, or a locals with a super varied meta, you still have to make certain decisions. Like, am I going to be playing a bunch of hand traps? Am I going to be playing power spells? Am I going to be playing just whatever high impact non-engine I think is good, like Nib or Droll or Dark Ruler or whatever? And I think that you first have to understand what makes good decks good, and then you can think about, is your deck bad, or what is holding back your deck, or what decisions are you making that are making your deck worse than it could be? And I have an overview of how I want to go through this video to try to keep myself on track and make this video not super long. Also, so my videos don't get tons of views and there aren't tons of comments, but there are some comments that I've noticed are cropping up over and over again. And I want to address those with some particular examples, like main decking cards like reframing, cross out, and call by, the concept of a win more card like Magician Souls, and combinations that sound good in theory, but are statistically very unlikely to happen. And I want to focus on using a probability calculator for this. And I want to tell you, first of all, if you have never used a probability calculator for building a deck in Yu-Gi-Oh!, I guarantee you that you do not know what you're doing. I promise you, as a matter of fact, 100%, you do not understand deck building if you've never done this. So, I am mostly making this video to address all of the comments that I keep responding to, and I don't have enough time to write out 20 paragraphs explaining the math behind something, so I'm just going to show you in one video. Okay, so Snake Eyes, let's start here as the context that we're going to place Whitewoods into and explain why Whitewoods is worse than this deck, but what its strengths are and how to play into those. So you have an engine that is about half the size of your deck here, or at least that's the size that people have decided to play. Now, Black Witch, Wanted, and Bonfire are very, very good cards because none of them necessarily require your normal summon. They can get you to a normal summon, but they don't immediately require that you use a normal summon for these cards to be useful. And they're also both starters and extenders. So if there's one thing that you've heard about what makes this deck good, you've probably heard that they have cards that are both starters and extenders. Now, really quickly, just to explain what that means, is if you go to, let's say, a Centurion build of Whitewoods, and you look at Trudea and Primera, these are cards that if you know what they do, you know that this gives you full combo. So either of these cards gives you full combo for anyone that's been playing Centurion this entire time. But these are not extenders. So if you draw Trudea and Primera, you summon one, it gets impermed. You can't normal summon the other because you've already used your normal summon. So these cards are specifically starters, but not extenders. Whereas Emblema Oath, which is the best card by far in the entire deck, is both a starter and an extender. And why is that? If this is the only card you have, it gets you whatever starter you want, and you continue playing from there. You also don't even have to use it in that way because you can set a Centurion spell or trap from your deck. So this really does search everything. And it's an extender because let's say that you summon Trudea or Primera and it gets impermed or whatever, but you have Oath, then you activate Oath and you just continue with the missing piece of the combo and you continue. So this is a phenomenal card. This is the best card by far in the entire Centurion deck. Now, there are not many cards like this in Centurion. The only other comparable card is Stand Up. And the reason is similar. This card can give you whatever piece you're missing, or if you don't have any pieces, it can give you a starter. Whereas the rest of these, like Gargoyle, is not a good card. This is like a combo piece or an extender, but it is not a starter because it requires you to already be able to play if you draw this card, and you prefer not to draw it, you prefer to search it during your combo. So in Whitewoods, what makes Whitewoods a little bit unusual is that it's not just that there are cards that you have to figure out, is this a starter or an extender or both or whatever, these cards typically don't function by themselves. Like, if you have only Reset in hand, you can't do anything. Even if you only have Sylve, summoning Sylve can search you Legend of the White Woods, but then you're in the same position where you need another card to interact with. So this is a 2-card combo deck, and that is one of the reasons that these cards, the toy cards, are so important. These majorly push the ceiling to another level. It is not the same deck without the toy cards. It is not worth playing, in my opinion, without the toy cards, regardless of the build that you're going for, because of how much card advantage these cards give you and how much they help you play with your current engine. So this is going to give us a different set of math that we have to play with for figuring out how good our deck is. Now let's go back to Snake Eyes for a second, because this is how I wanted to show you like what makes a deck good. If we begin with just these 9 cards, which is already more starter extender cards than in our entire Whitewoods deck, let's say we have a deck size of 40 and our hand size is 5 because we're going first, okay? And so let's say we're talking about Bonfire, Witch, and Wanted. So those are 9 cards because we're playing 3 of each. Now, if you're going first, you have a 74% chance of drawing at least one of these 9 cards, okay? So this isn't the chance of drawing only one, it is drawing at least one. The chance of drawing at least 2 is 31%, so it's a minority of the time. Now, if you were going second, so we'll put the hand size at 6, then you have a 80% chance or a 40%, 41% chance of drawing at least 2, okay? But that's not your entire engine. These are just some of the best cards in your entire engine. If we include cards like Snake Eyes Ash and Poplar, then that number goes up. So we would go to 14, and then you're looking at a 94% chance to draw at least 1, or a 70% chance to draw at least 2 if you're going second. I don't want to go over these numbers in excruciating detail, but I just want to show you what you have to play against and why Snake Eyes is better than every other deck, so that you don't make mistakes when you're building Whitewoods just because you're comfortable playing helmet cards like Crossout or Called By or whatever. Now, this number actually goes up in reality because their extenders work extremely well when you're interacting with hand traps. Like, if you summon Diabellstar the Black Witch and it gets impermed, but you already drew original Sinful Spoils, you still just activate this card. It doesn't stop you from playing. It's not like, if you're familiar with the Super Heavy Samurai package, if you draw the Big Benki, your entire combo is bricked because you can't resolve the card effects. It's not like that. If you draw these cards, you still gain advantage. You can still play. The only real bricks here are Snake Eyes, Diabellstar, and Flamberge, and you can still interact with them if you draw them in your hand by placing them into the grave and bringing them back and stuff like that. So these bricks aren't as hard as Big Benki, but you don't want to draw them, whereas the rest of the engine is extraordinarily good. And this is what allows them to play this many hand traps. And this is the last point that I want to touch on before I go back to the Whitewood stuff. Why does it matter that you can play this many non-engine? So let's say that we are on 18 hand traps, okay? And we have lost the dice roll, but it's the opponent's turn 0, okay? So we have 5 cards in our hand. Somebody commented on one of my videos. Let's see, did I make a note of it here? Okay, so they were saying, why don't you just play 9 hand traps instead of your board breakers, because you don't have space for 15 hand traps in Whitewoods. They're saying this. That's not true. You do have space for that. But they're saying, if you don't have space for 15 hand traps in Whitewoods, why not just play 9 hand traps instead of breakers so you don't lose to FTK strategies like Gimmick Puppet or Branded or Centurion. Here's the thing. If you have 9 hand traps in your deck, okay, the chance of you drawing at least one of them, so this is you've lost the dice roll, okay, your opponent is playing, is 74%. And you may be thinking, oh, that's pretty good. You know, that's like, you know, most games I'll draw at least 1 hand trap. The chance of you drawing at least 2 of them is 31%. That's a relatively small percentage of games, okay? You're butting up close to like a third of your games, you'll draw at least 2 hand traps. If you play against Snake Eyes and you draw 1 hand trap, rip up your hand trap, throw it in the garbage, and go home, because you have no chance, like actually no chance of beating this deck. So the reason that this deck plays all these hand traps is because they know that. They know that you can't beat Snake Eyes or actual good decks like Yubel by only drawing 1 hand trap. So if you instead take the number And I'll show this at 1 first to show why the probability calculator is important. If you take this number from 9 to 15, okay, you have a 92% chance of drawing at least 1, but more importantly, you have a 63% chance of drawing at least 2. So in decks like Pure Punk, if you played Yu-Gi-Oh at that time, you played 15 hand traps because you wanted your standard hand to look like, for example, Imperm, Ash, and then 3 engine cards. If you were playing 18 hand traps, okay, the chance of you drawing at least 2 hand traps in an opening hand is 76%. That is an extremely high percentage. That is the vast majority of games. And if you go even higher, a slim, 40% is actually a large minority of the time, you're going to draw 3 hand traps. Now, this is close enough to 50% that if you were playing a Snake Eyes hand trap mirror match, you need to understand that your opponent could very likely have 3 hand traps in their hand. So when you play this deck, you play in a way that you check for hand traps. The order in which you sequence your cards, for example, if you start with Black Witch and your opponent does not interact with this card, that usually means, not always, depends on the build they're playing, that they have not drawn Imperm or Veiler, but they could have drawn an Ash Blossom or an Ogre or a Nib or some other type of hand trap. So the better that you know the deck and the order that you sequence your cards in determines how you can check for certain types of hand traps. And there are ways that you can do that in Whitewoods as well. So I just want to show this is what you were up against. When you're thinking about is Whitewoods a good deck or not, you have to think about how efficient is your engine? How many starter and extender cards exist in your engine? And how much space does that allow you to play either just like hand traps, non-engine, power spells, whatever, versus other cards that are not gas like cross out or called by. Okay, I also want to briefly talk about functional redundancy, and this is actually very related to this question about Magician Souls, like why not play Magician Souls? This entire Snake Eyes deck does almost the same thing regardless of the card that you draw. If you draw Wanted, or if you draw Witch, or Bonfire, or whatever, all these things can get you to full combo, but at the same time, if your full combo is stopped, like if you get Impermed or Veilered on the Black Witch, but you drew the Snake Eyes Ash, you just normal summon the Snake Eyes Ash. And then if they hit you with another Imperm or Veiler or Ash or whatever, then you just Bonfire and you're continuing with the same exact play you're doing anyhow. So functional redundancy in Yu-Gi-Oh! Is an extremely big deal because it's the difference between clogging your hand with engine pieces that don't add on to what you're trying to build versus being able to play through many different interruptions. Okay, so let's go to Whitewoods now, and let me just address the Magician Souls things right here because this is to do with functional redundancy. If you actually play this deck, if you don't just think about does this sound good in my head or not. If you actually play this deck, one thing that you will notice is drawing a lot of cards is actually not very good in this deck. First of all, drawing cards is always better if you're on hand traps. Playing a Magician Soul package reduces the amount of hand traps you can play, but you can still play hand traps. It's possible. You could play a hand trap build here. But the problem is you only need 2 cards because this is a 2-card combo deck to get into your 2-card combos, and those get you everything. Like if you have Toy Box and Rosette, there's nothing that you're missing. No additional cards will make your combo better. So Magician Souls draws you into redundant cards that are not functionally redundant. They're just redundant. Drawing into another Toy Soldier after you've set it off of box doesn't help you. Drawing into another Rosette or another Extender, which you can already search through your combo, doesn't help you. And it's also win more in the sense that you have to have cards that interact with this. Like you have to have drawn a box or a soldier or something. And if you have any of these other cards, you don't even need the Magician Souls to play. So it's a card that sounds good in theory because it gives you advantage, but it doesn't actually advance your game plan. So this is not comparable to the Wanted engine, for example, or Bonfire in Snake Eyes. Okay, let's go back to... okay, let's talk briefly about what's the difference between a brick, an engine requirement, a combo piece, starter, extender, and so on. Now, I was taking another look at Centurion and thinking, how could I make this deck have less bad draws? Now, if you think about what makes something a brick, all right, let's look at this card, Wake Up Centurion. This is one of the newer cards that just came out, or is now coming out. And the thing about this card is you never, ever, ever want to draw this, but it raises the ceiling of your deck substantially. It allows you to do things like dump your Phalanx, which is what allows Centurion to play through Nibiru. And so it adds a useful thing to your deck that your deck couldn't do before. But if you draw this card, it requires a lot of setup. So let's see, if a monster card is face up in your spell and trap zone, so face up, so you have to have already began playing with your engine, then you can declare a level between 4 or 8, special summon a Centurion token with a declared level, but it can't be used as fusion or link material. So not only is this card not a starter, but it's not even a good extender because it requires you to have already established something on your field. So this is not a good card, it is just a combo piece. Then you have cards like Phalanx, where you can target a face-up monster on the field, banish it, and if you do during the standby phase of the next turn, special summon it. And then it has a grave effect. This is usually the one that helps you play around Nib, where you can banish it from your grave, target a Centurion, synchro monster, and special summon it. Now, this card isn't a hard brick in the same way that Wake Up requires you to have setup, but it's better if you search it. You'd rather not draw it, because sometimes it can make your combo worse if you're like, for example, going to make an Auxilia, but you don't have a search target for it because you've already gone through your engine. Then you have cards like Toy Tank, which are not bad to draw because if you send it off a Whitewood's card, you don't lose card advantage, it'll bring itself back, but you don't actually want to draw it because it doesn't give you the setup that Toy Box or Toy Soldier does. So that's why you have ratios like 3 Box, 3 Soldier, and even a Rota for the Soldier. I mentioned in like briefly this example of Big Denki. Is this what it's, yeah, this one. And this is one of those cards that is like a true brick, because if you play the bare minimum engine and you draw this card, you can't resolve the rest of your combo. So we don't want to play cards like those. Snake Eyes doesn't have to play that, and we don't want to have to play stuff like that. Okay. So I went over the difference between having like 9, 15, and 18 non-engine spots. And one thing that I want to make clear here is if you can only fit, let's say 10, okay? Let's say you can only fit 10 cards into your non-engine slots. And so you know that most of the time, so 37% of the time, you'll draw 2 or more. So most of the time you're not going to draw 2 or more, you'll only draw 1. You want that card that you're only going to see one of in a typical hand, like you're only going to see one of these non-engine pieces, to be very, very high impact. So the amount of non-engine you can play determines how high or low impact that non-engine is allowed to be. If you can get up to 18, they don't have to be all Dark Rulers and evenly matched. They can be Ash Blossom, Imperm, Valor, all these low impact hand traps. So if you have built your deck to include other engines like the Centurion cards or the Horus cards or a larger Centurion package or whatever, then maybe you can play hand traps. If you don't want to play starter extenders like Emblema Oath and you think, you know, I just want this to be part of my combo because I can already special summon it off of Asteria, because this one, where is it written here? Special is a light spellcaster tuner from your deck. It does not have to be a Whitewood's card. You can summon Primera. So, you know, you can make those calls, but you have to understand that the amount of non-engine that you're playing determines how high impact that non-engine has to be. Now, I have included a Nib and Valor here just for reference, because in one of the standard combos I show, you make Gallant Granite to search Nib, and that makes searching Valor better because you have a Nib Valor combo. I have a video on this, so I'm not going to go into that right now, but you can watch that if you're curious as to why I think this is good. Okay, let's get back on track. Okay, the other thing in determining your non-engine is, will you lose the game if you don't play non-engine? Generically speaking, the answer is yes, but more specifically, it's like what type of non-engine? If there are a bunch of people playing Gimmick Puppet at your locals and you don't have hand traps, you're going to lose. If you lose the dice roll, you're probably losing the match. If you win the dice roll, you must win your first game. Branded, they don't have to set up the puppet lock on their turn 0, but the deck is kind of hard to beat if you don't have hand traps, and just drawing Dark Ruler isn't going to stop you getting puppet locked. If you're playing against like pure Centurion or like a Whitewood Centurion or some other Calamities type deck, you don't need hand traps, but you do need different types of non-engine like Book of Eclipse or like Prosperity into Eclipse, things that stop them having the materials on field required to go into like Crimson Dragon, Calamities, that type of stuff. Okay, so I've covered some basic things to do with deck building, and in the interest of time, I'm going to skip straight to these examples here. I've already gone over Magician Souls. Let's talk about droplet and hand traps, because I got a comment about this. And the guy was saying, droplets is very good. If you droplets and send the toy soldier or the tank, they get to trigger, because if you read it, it says if this set card in the spell and trap zone is sent to the graveyard, so that's the activation procedure, you can special summon this card. So you can droplet send a set soldier or a set tank and it will bring itself back. Now, droplets does not interact with any other card in your deck. These cards, the Whitewood spells and traps, they have to be sent to activate a monster effect, and droplets is a spell. So let's actually have a look here. If you are in trouble. Okay, let's say you're against a deck that will calamities lock you and they're waiting for their main phase to be able to activate their effects. You have to have drawn the soldier or the tank, and tank is extremely low impact. You can't toy box and search for these things or you're going to get calamity locked. Okay, let's just take this as the first example. So let's say you have soldier. There are only 3 soldiers in your deck, and you want to look at the probability of drawing both soldier and droplet. Just one of each. The percentage chance is 9.8% if you're going first, or 13.9% if you're going second. Now, this is similar for reference to if you were playing driver and gamma or whatever. This 13% is approximately the chance in 40 of drawing driver. And if you have played that card, you know that you actually do draw that card like some amount of the time, but it's a very small minority. So you can't build your deck, because hypothetically, if you were to draw soldier and droplet, then you would get value off of droplet. But then you may be asking, okay, well, we're not going to be under the threat of a main phase calamity lock every single time. So what if I have toy box and soldier? What if we're including rota, toy box, and soldier? Because tank is super, super low value. Okay, so that's 7 cards. So let's say box, soldier, rota. So this puts you at a 26% of the time you are going to see this combination of cards. This is assuming, by the way, that your opponent does not interrupt your box. After they have established your board, you activate box, and if they know anything about your deck, they know that box is a very, very strong card. And you may be saying that this is not a hard once per turn, but the chance of you drawing 2 boxes, I'll show you in a second, is extremely low. So if your opponent interrupts the box that you activate, this is not going to happen. You cannot build your deck for these super hypothetical scenarios where in a best case scenario, you have a 26% chance to draw droplet and one of the cards that droplet works with. And let's also keep in mind that realistically, if you are on power spells and you have the droplets to clear your opponent's board, you cannot send just one card. Like that'll negate only one thing. You're going to have to send other cards in your hand and then still leave at least at a bare minimum a 2-card combo, because your deck can't work if you don't have a 2-card combo. So don't deck build for these like super specific scenarios. Also, by the way, just to go over, if you are looking at the probability of drawing toy box, if you are going first, drawing 1 is 33%, drawing at least 2 is 3%, so irrelevant, and if you go second, it's 5%, which is also irrelevant. So don't ever bank on having like another toy box. Okay, let's see. What have I not covered yet? Oh yeah, also the idea of droplet and hand traps. Guys, listen, if you are combining droplet with hand traps, I'm not going to say that it is impossible for this to work, but you need to understand your card economy. If you have an Ash Blossom and a droplet in your hand and your opponent goes first and you Ash Blossom, when you start your turn, you're going to be a card down. So your droplets has less cards to send, remembering that your deck is a minimum 2-card combo deck, which would prefer to also have an extender in hand if your 2-card combo is interrupted. So droplets is an extremely costly card for you to play if you're combining it with hand traps. Now, if you're combining droplets with power spells, it's better because you're not losing card economy while your opponent plays before your turn is started. But the decks that generally benefit from droplet the most are decks that have a lot of normal spells. So like, let's say you activate Branded Fusion, and then let's say you chain Branded Opening. This is not unusual, an unusual type of scenario. And then you chain link 3 droplet and you send the Branded Fusion and the Branded Opening. You aren't losing any card advantage from the Fusion and the Opening. Those cards are still resolving. You're just sending them as cost for the droplet. So that's why droplet is so popular in Branded, because the card is basically free in their deck, but it is not free in our deck. Okay, Now, in the interest of time, I will quickly show four different versions of this. There's like two Centurion versions and two non-Centurion versions. So first of all, I want to show you that you can play a lot of hand traps in this build. If you look at this example here, and by the way, this is on the assumption that you must play the toy cards in this deck. There's no option to not play the toy cards. You have space for here's 10, 11, 12, let's skip this for now, 13, 14 hand traps. Iris Sword Soul, I have explained in another combo video, so I'm not going to go over that right now, but that is a combo piece, an extender, that has a lot of synergy with the deck. You don't have to play this card. So let's say we were going for this 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, and we change this to another hand trap. That would be 15 hand traps. So that is comfortably putting us in the range of our standard typical hand, looking like 2 hand traps and then 3 engine pieces. Now, you can technically change the skill drains to be more hand traps and go up to the magical 18 number. Now that will give you an extremely strong, very, very flexible game 1. And always remember when you're deck building that your game 1 is the game 1 that you don't know if you're winning the dice roll. Siding comes in afterwards, okay? I'll get to reframing in a second here. So the thing about Skill Drain, though, is that Skill Drain is extraordinarily powerful in this deck. Similar to with Snake Eyes, where Snake Eye Ash, if you, hello. So Snake Eyes Ash says, you can send 2 face-up cards you control to the graveyard, including this card, semicolon, that is cost. Special summon a Snake Eye monster from your hand or deck. So, the Skill Drain doesn't actually negate the Ash because it only negates monsters while they're on field. But when Ash sends itself and Skill Drain as cost, it is no longer on the field and it successfully resolves. This is the same for all of your cards. It doesn't matter if you have the Reset in hand versus you have the Asteria on your field and you want to send a spell or trap from your hand or field to the graveyard, cost, special summon a light spellcaster tuner from your deck. Or even with the Arcia, send a spell or trap from your hand or field to the graveyard, cost, draw a card. All of these out to your own skill drain. And one of the reasons that I like this with the Nibiru Veiler combo that I've showed, so this is the combo where you make Gallant Granite and search Nibiru, and the Arciela searches the Veiler, so you have Nib Veiler in your hand, and you don't care about nibbing yourself, and I won't go into those details because it's another video. The reason that that type of stuff is good is it becomes almost a win condition under skill drain. Like, no one can play under Nibiru and Veiler and skill drain. They would have to draw extremely specific cards, and then they're probably not going to be able to kill you on your turn anyhow, and then you can decide, do you want to turn off your skill drain, or do you want to sit on it until you draw something else? So you can absolutely play this deck with a high hand trap count. Now, there's also an option to play with a lower non-engine count and instead play power spells. Then you have to make the decision, do you actually want to do the Gallant stuff? Like, do you want to do the Nibiru Veiler? Do you want to have that as part of your combo? Or do you just want to play power spells? You for sure max out on the toy engine still, playing Reinforcement of the Army. I like Skill Drain because it's not only a going first card. If you go second and you draw this card, this is usually like something that allows you to stall, especially in a meta where everybody is going to be playing cards like Appaloosa that lose to this. So this is very, very strong. So yeah, if you want to play more engine, then you can do that, and you can play power spell. However, if you are playing power spell, you might wonder, why don't I play power spells, but more engines with a different engine? Like, why not play Centurion? And then you have to think about, how many bad draws can I accept in my deck? If my standard typical hand is going to give me 1 non-engine, and then the rest of what's in my deck, how many poor draws can I have? Gargoyle is a very bad draw. Do I also want to main Wake Up Centurion? How bad is this actually? Okay, let's take a look at this real quick. So let's say you have Gargoyle, Phalanx, and Wake Up. And this is going to answer the reframing crossout called by kind of discussion here. So let's say we are going first, okay? And we have bad draws. And let's say, actually, let's be a little bit more specific. Let's say Wake Up, Phalanx, Gargoyle. Okay, 3 cards there. The chance of us drawing at least one of these is a decently large minority of the time. If we go up to going second, 40% of the time, 40% of the time, you're going to see at least Gargoyle, Wake Up, or Phalanx. You don't want to draw any of those cards. You want to search all of those cards, and the Wake Up and the Gargoyle are the worst because they do absolutely nothing. It's not like you can at least set it with the Phalanx. So what happens if you're also playing, cross out, called by, reframing? Okay, so let's be like a little bit crazy here. So reframing is 1, called by is 1, and cross out is 3. Okay, so 3, 4, 5 more cards. So 5, 6, 7, 8. The vast majority of your games, if you are playing stuff like this, you are going to be seeing at least one of these cards you do not want to draw, which means that this is if you're going second. If you're going first, it is still the vast majority, 70% of the time, that you are drawing these cards that you do not want to draw. And then a quarter of your games, you're seeing at least 2 of them. Or if you're going second, it's a third of the time. You do not want this to happen. So much so that in my Centurion Power Spell version, I'm actually considering just not maining these cards, because if I go first and I draw one of these cards, it's not as bad, because it's more likely that I've gotten to a point in my combo where Wake Up is actually live, or Gargoyle is actually live, or, Phalanx is more relevant because I can dump it from my hand to the grave and potentially banish to bring back in the end phase or whatever. And so you should consider, if you like cards like Call By and Cross Out because you feel protected, this is basically what Helmet means, how much does that actually hurt you? Because it's conditional, your opponent has to have drawn the thing that you wanna cross out or call by, but is it actually making your deck worse? Is it hurting your chance of seeing the cards that you need to see? The answer is yes, but you have to think about how many of those cards do you allow in your deck. So personally, if I'm going to play cards like this and I want to go full combo, I don't need the Dark Rulers in my deck. I don't need Evenly. I don't necessarily need Nibiru Veiler, although I do think these are very, very good going first because they're part of the combo. So I could put cards like Reframing, Phalanx, and Wake Up in my deck just by taking out my Dark Rulers. It's a very, very easy siding pattern, which is something that I'm not going to cover in this video because it'll be too long, but siding patterns is another big part of ratios. So yeah, and then you can still play hand traps if you're playing the Centurion cards. It is possible that you can not play Gargoyle, or you can side the Gargoyle for similar reasons, and you still can Calamity's Lock or Blazar on your opponent's turn. It's just slightly slower. Whereas playing Gargoyle or cards like Wake Up allow you in this version of the deck to, for example, go for a Synchro 12 like Auxilla or Legatia, and Crimson Dragon into a Blazar, and then make another Crimson Dragon all in your own turn. You can't use this effect more than once per turn. And then in your opponent's turn, you Calamity's Lock under the protection of your own Blazar. So the ceiling does dramatically go up the larger your Centurion engine is, but the chance of you drawing bad cards also dramatically goes up. Now, last thing I will say, some people might be like, oh, well, I played these cards in my deck at my locals and, I came first or whatever. And what you have to understand about the stats of this is if you were playing a 4-round Swiss in a locals, you are not punished as hard for having a bad deck because there aren't enough rounds to expose how bad your deck really is. If you're going to a large tournament like a YCS, especially a 2-day event where there could be like 12 rounds of Swiss, if your deck is not super consistent, you will not top. You simply will not top. It is not possible. That's why you don't see these kinds of decks in top, or you'll see like only one sneak in. So you should take that into consideration. I think that ultimately the answer to what version should you play will depend on, do you think that you really need hand traps for your local meta or the tournament that you're going to? Or can you play like a more power spell type build? Also take into consideration, by the way, that Thrust has some functional overlap with cards like Called By and Crossout, because let's say that you summon Sylve and you have Reset in hand. This is something that I go for quite often, because a lot of people who are somewhat familiar with these cards, they'll think if you normal summon Sylve, you're using your normal summon and you're not using it on Asteria, so your hand is probably bad and you're hoping for like some kind of extender to continue playing. And so they may imperm or Veiler this Sylve, right? So if they do that, like let's say that they Veiler this card or they Ash this card and you Thrust, you have to set the card, right? So it's like you can't use it this turn. But then you take the Reset in your hand or the Arcia in your hand, and you send the card to the grave. It resets itself, and now as a new card, you can activate it this turn. So there are ways in this deck to check for hand traps, which I'm also not going to spend time on in this video, that make Thrust somewhat of an engine card. And also remember that you can search woes and do the same thing, where you can send it and then reset it. And even if you don't do that, you can still use it in your opponent's turn. So there's still like absolute worst case scenarios where if you're sitting on hand traps and you summon this and that's the end of your turn and you just thrust this, that maybe you can survive on like a Silvera, and then, you know, add back the Reset to your hand or whatever. There are lots of things that you can do in this deck that make you play through stuff better. You just have to think carefully about how often do you accept drawing bad cards? How many bad cards are actually in your deck? And the very last thing that I'll say is the reason that I think Rota is good in this deck is if you actually look at the toy cards, the good ones, so not tank, so box and soldier. So let's say toy good stuff is 6 cards plus Rota is 7 cards. So if you're going first, the chance of you seeing at least one of them is about 64%. And I have said before that this is what makes the deck good, almost to the point where I think that you should seriously consider playing Prosperity. I don't know if, let's see, do I even have a build up for this to show? No, I don't have like an up-to-date build to show with this right now, but Prosperity is almost worth playing just to make sure that you always see your toy cards. So that's something else that you should also consider, and it also ups the likelihood of you accessing Skill Drain, which is a big deal because this is a win condition combined with Blazar. I showed this in another combo, but if you have Skill Drain and Blazar, if you read this real quick, you can banish this card until the end phase to activate one of these effects, cost. So this is no longer on the field after you pay the cost, and then you perform the negation. So if you have Blazar under your own skill drain, there are very few things that can beat that. I also have like a gameplay video where I show this combo and why this works against decks that have lots of interactions. Okay, so that's the end of the video. I hope that I have generically covered what makes a deck good, what is functional redundancy, why you have to play a certain amount of certain cards, especially when it comes to like hand traps versus high impact non-engine like power spells or Nibiru Droll, whatever. The kinds of decks that make you reconsider if you should be on hand traps or not, why you should be wary of combining droplets with hand traps or thinking that droplets is good in this deck because you don't see the toy cards in combination with droplet. Remember, it's not just about seeing the toy cards, it's about seeing it in combination with another card. That's how the math works out on that, and that's why you need to use the probability calculator. I've covered why the very strong helmet going first cards are things that you should highly consider moving to your side deck and not maining. And I've gone over a Whitewoods toy deck and a Whitewoods Centurion deck and some different options you can play for that. In my next video, I think I may spend a little bit more time explaining one of my favorite builds right now, which this is not the final version, but is playing a Centurion package with some of the engine pieces sided. So yeah, that's all for now.